Welcome to the store. Don't forget to subscribe, and support me.
The wind howled through the narrow alleys of Southwatch, the southernmost stronghold of human civilization. It was a city huddled between towering cliffs, surrounded by glaciers that loomed like walls of death. The eternal winter that gripped the world had choked off every resource, every sign of life, and for generations, people lived in the shadow of despair. Harriet stood at the edge of the city walls, staring out at the desolate horizon. The endless sheets of snow and ice stretched out as far as the eye could see, broken only by the occasional jagged peak of a frozen mountain. She shivered, not from the cold. Her thick coat of fur and leather protected her from that, but from the weight of the decision she had made. The heart of summer, her invention, was her only hope. It was a device she had spent years working on, using every scrap of knowledge and every bit of ancient magic she could find. It was small, compact enough to be carried in a pack, but powerful enough to melt the ice if given the right circumstances. The problem was the circumstances. The frost sorcerer, the mythical figure who had cast the world into this frozen hell, controlled the cold with an iron grip. His power was vast, and his fortress lay far to the north, deep in the ice wastelands where no human had ever returned from. It was said that his magic had twisted the very land around him, creating monsters of ice and shadow that guarded his domain, but Harriet wasn't one to back down from a challenge. She had lost too much to give up now. The winter had claimed her family, taken her friends, and reduced the once flourishing southern cities to frozen husks. She had spent her life trying to make things right, and now, she had the chance to do it. Behind her, the heavy thud of boots on stone announced Kell's arrival. He was a giant of a man, all muscle and grim determination, his beard thick with frost. He had fought in more battles than anyone could count and bore the scars to prove it. But even he looked weary as he approached. "Are you sure about this?" Kell asked, his voice low, as if afraid the cold itself might overhear them. "We don't know what's waiting for us up there." Harriet tightened her grip on the rail, her eyes never leaving the horizon. "We don't have a choice, Kell. If we don't try, we're all as good as dead. The winters are getting worse. Even Southwatch won't survive another decade." Kell sighed, crossing his arms over his broad chest. "I know. I just don't like the idea of marching into the frost sorcerer's territory. I've heard stories, none of them end well." Harriet turned to face him, her face set in determination. "That's why we have to end it. I've spent my life building this." She patted the bag slung over her shoulder where the heart of summer rested, "and it's our only shot. We take it to the sorcerer's fortress, we destroy his magic, and we bring back spring." Kell grunted, not entirely convinced but unwilling to argue further. "What about the others? Do they know what they're getting into?" "They know," Harriet said. "They're ready." The team was small, just the way Harriet wanted it. There was Lyra, a young mage with a fiery temper and an even fierier magic that had saved their skins more than once. And Hakon, the best tracker in the southern lands, his knowledge of the frozen terrain unmatched by anyone. The four of them were the only ones Harriet trusted to make this journey, and survive. "Let's go," she said, pushing off from the rail. "The sooner we start, the sooner we finish." The city gates creaked open behind them, and the bitter wind bit into their skin as they stepped out into the wasteland. Harriet felt the weight of her invention pressing against her back, a reminder of the burden she carried, not just the device, but the hopes of every person in Southwatch, and beyond. The days blurred together as they trudged through the snow. The wind never let up, and the cold was a constant presence, gnawing at their bones despite their thick clothing. They camped in caves when they could find them, huddling around small fires that did little to ward off the chill. But Harriet never let them stop for long. Every moment wasted was another moment. The frost sorcerer's power grew stronger. "We're close now," Hakon said one night as they crouched in the mouth of a shallow cave, their fire flickering weakly against the cold. "The ice feels different here. Denser. We're entering his domain." Harriet nodded, her eyes scanning the dark horizon. There was a tension in the air, something that made her skin crawl. She could feel the magic here, thick and oppressive, like a weight pressing down on them from all sides. The frost sorcerer was close. "We need to move faster," she said, pulling her coat tighter around her. "If we don't reach the fortress soon, we'll freeze to death out here." Kel grunted in agreement, rubbing his hands together over the fire. "What's the plan once we get there?" Harriet hesitated for a moment before answering. "We fight our way in. I'll need time to set up the Heart of Summer and activate it. Once it's running, we use it to destroy the sorcerer's magic and break his control over the winter." "And if it doesn't work?" Lyra asked, her voice edged with doubt. "It will work," Harriet said, more to convince herself than anyone else. "It has to." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken fears. None of them wanted to admit it, but they all knew the truth. The odds were against them. The frost sorcerer's power was ancient, and they were just 4 people with a single device. But Harriet refused to let doubt creep in. She had come too far to turn back now. The next morning, they set out again, their breath fogging in the frigid air. The landscape around them grew more treacherous with every step. The snow was deeper here, the wind more violent, and the cold seeped into their bones no matter how many layers they wore. But worse than the cold were the creatures. They appeared without warning, rising out of the snow like ghosts. Massive beasts made of ice and frost, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. They moved with terrifying speed, their claws rending the air as they attacked. Kel was the first to react, drawing his sword and meeting the nearest creature head-on. His blade bit into the ice, sending shards flying, but the creature didn't slow. It lashed out with a clawed hand, knocking him back into the snow with a grunt of pain. Lyra was next, her hands glowing with fire as she unleashed a wave of heat at the creatures. The ice hissed and cracked under the force of her magic, and one of the beasts let out a high-pitched screech as it melted away into a puddle of water. But for every creature they destroyed, more seemed to rise from the snow, their forms coalescing from the ice itself. Harriet fumbled with the Heart of Summer, pulling it from her pack and activating the device. It hummed to life, the runes glowing faintly as it began to radiate warmth. The creatures faltered for a moment, their icy forms shuddering as the heat washed over them. But it wasn't enough. They were too close to the frost sorcerer's domain, and his power was too strong here. "We can't hold them off forever," Hakon shouted, firing arrows into the mass of creatures. "We need to keep moving." Harriet knew he was right. The Heart of Summer wasn't enough to destroy the creatures, but it could hold them at bay long enough for them to escape. She strapped the device to her back and shouted for the others to follow her. They ran, the creatures snapping at their heels as they raced across the frozen landscape. The wind howled around them, carrying with it the sorcerer's malevolent magic. Harriet could feel it pressing down on her, a cold so deep it felt like it was freezing her soul. But she pushed forward, the Heart of Summer pulsing with heat against her back, a beacon of hope in the icy darkness. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the creatures stopped. Harriet glanced over her shoulder and saw them standing at the edge of a vast chasm, their glowing eyes fixed on the group as they retreated. They had reached the frost sorcerer's fortress. They stood at the edge of the chasm, the frost sorcerer's fortress looming in the distance like a jagged shard of ice piercing the sky. The wind was sharper here, colder than it had been anywhere else on their journey, as if the very air was a weapon wielded by the sorcerer himself. Harriet's breath came in ragged gasps, her legs burning from the endless march through snow and ice, but there was no time to rest. The fortress lay ahead, a massive structure carved from the glaciers themselves, its towers gleaming under the weak sunlight like frozen spears. The path leading to it was narrow and treacherous, winding across the chasm on a bridge of ice that seemed barely wide enough to support their weight. "We're not going to make it across that," Kel muttered, his voice barely audible over the wind. Harriet glanced at him, her eyes narrowing. "We don't have a choice." Hakon, who had been scouting ahead, returned, his face grim. "There's no other way. The ice is thinner than it looks. If we try to go around, we'll lose days, time we don't have." Lyra stepped forward, her fiery magic already crackling at her fingertips. "I can try to melt the ice as we go, make it stronger." Harriet shook her head. "No. The sorcerer will sense the magic. He'll know we're coming." She paused, scanning the fortress ahead. "We have to get in there quietly. If he realizes we're here before we can set up the heart of summer, we're finished." Kel looked at the narrow bridge, then back at Harriet. "If that thing collapses under our weight, we're finished anyway." Harriet met his gaze steadily. "Then we better hope it doesn't collapse." Without another word, she stepped onto the bridge, the ice creaking ominously beneath her boots. Every step felt like walking on the edge of a knife, the wind pushing at her, trying to shove her into the abyss below. She kept her eyes forward, focused on the distant towers of the fortress. One step at a time. One step closer to ending the winter. Behind her, the others followed in silence, each of them aware of the danger but trusting in her leadership. The heart of summer hummed softly against Harriet's back, its warmth the only thing keeping the biting cold at bay. But even that warmth was beginning to fade. They were getting closer to the source of the frost sorcerer's magic, and it was stronger than anything Harriet had imagined. The bridge groaned as they reached the halfway point, a deep crack spider-webbing through the ice beneath their feet. Harriet froze, her heart pounding in her chest. If the bridge gave way now, there was nothing that would stop them from plummeting into the darkness below. "Keep moving," she whispered, more to herself than to the others. "Keep moving." They crossed the rest of the bridge in tense silence, every step an agony of waiting for the ice to shatter beneath them. But somehow, miraculously, they made it to the other side. Harriet exhaled in relief as her boots touched solid ground again, but the relief was short-lived. The entrance to the fortress loomed before them, a massive gate of frozen iron, covered in intricate runes that glowed with a faint, eerie light. There was no way to enter without the sorcerer knowing they were there. His magic was everywhere, infused into the very walls of the fortress. They were walking into his domain now, and he would be ready for them once we're inside. Harriet said, her voice barely a whisper, "I'll need time to activate the heart of summer. It has to be placed at the center of the fortress, where the magic is strongest. If I can get it there, it should be enough to destroy the sorcerer's power." "And if we can't?" Kel asked, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "Then we're dead," Harriet replied bluntly. "There's no other option." Kel grunted in response, but there was no argument left in him. They had come too far to turn back now. He pushed against the iron gate, his strength forcing it open with a grinding creak. Beyond the gate lay a vast hall, its walls lined with icicles that hung like daggers, the floor a sheet of polished ice that reflected the dim light from above. It was deathly silent, the kind of silence that made Harriet's skin crawl. They moved cautiously through the hall, every step echoing in the stillness. Harriet kept her eyes on the walls, watching for any sign of movement. The frost sorcerer was here somewhere. She could feel it in the air, the oppressive weight of his magic pressing down on her. But where? As they reached the center of the hall, the air grew colder, sharper. The light dimmed until it was almost complete darkness, and Harriet's breath froze in front of her face, hanging in the air like smoke. Then, suddenly, he appeared. The frost sorcerer emerged from the shadows at the far end of the hall, his form indistinct at first, as if made of the very ice and snow that surrounded them. He was tall, taller than any man, his body cloaked in swirling mists of frost. His eyes burned with a cold, blue light, and his voice, when he spoke, was like the creaking of glaciers. "You dare enter my domain," he hissed, his voice echoing through the hall. Harriet stood her ground, the heart of summer humming at her back. "Your reign ends here, sorcerer. We're taking back the world." The sorcerer laughed, a sound like ice cracking. "You are but mortals, insects in the face of my power. The winter will never end. The cold will consume all." Harriet stepped forward, her hand resting on the heart of summer. "Not if I can help it." With a swift motion, she pulled the device from her back, setting it down in the center of the hall. It began to glow, the runes along its surface lighting up one by one as it activated. A pulse of warmth radiated from it, pushing back the cold, but the sorcerer did not flinch. "You think your toy will save you?" he sneered, raising one hand. "You will freeze before it even touches me." Ice erupted from the floor, jagged spikes shooting toward them, but Lyra was ready. She threw up her hands, flames bursting from her fingertips and melting the ice before it could reach them. The fire clashed with the cold, the two forces fighting for dominance as the sorcerer advanced. Kel charged, his sword gleaming in the faint light as he swung it at the sorcerer's chest, but the blade met only air. The sorcerer's form shimmered, dissolving into mist as he reappeared on the other side of the hall, his eyes glowing brighter. "Fools," he snarled. "You cannot kill me. I am the winter." Harriet worked frantically, adjusting the heart of summer, trying to boost its power. It wasn't enough. The sorcerer's magic was too strong here, too deeply entrenched. She needed more time, but they didn't have it. "Hakon," she shouted. "Get him away from the device." Hakon nodded, drawing his bow and firing a rapid volley of arrows at the sorcerer. The arrows sliced through the air, forcing the sorcerer to shift his focus, but it was only a distraction. Harriet continued her work, her hands shaking from the cold. The heart of summer began to hum louder, the runes glowing brighter as it gathered energy. It was almost ready. "Just a little more time," the sorcerer roared, raising both hands as a wall of ice erupted from the floor, separating him from the others. Harriet could feel the cold intensify, the air freezing in her lungs. He was going to crush them with the weight of his power. She had to act now. Without thinking, she reached out, placing her hands directly on the heart of summer. It burned under her touch, the magic surging through her, but it wasn't enough. She needed more power, more energy to break through the sorcerer's magic. There was only one source left. Harriet closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of the heart of summer flowing into her. She could feel it draining her, pulling at her very life force, but she didn't stop. This was the only way. If she didn't do this, the world would be lost. The device pulsed with a brilliant light, blinding in its intensity, and for a moment, everything was still. Then the light exploded outward, a wave of heat and fire that swept through the hall, engulfing the sorcerer in its wake. His scream echoed through the air as his form disintegrated, his magic unraveling in the face of Harriet's power. The ice melted, the walls of the fortress crumbling as the winter began to break. The cold receded, the storms lifting, and for the first time in centuries, the sun broke through the clouds, but Harriet didn't see it. She collapsed to the floor, the last of her strength gone. Her vision blurred, the warmth of the heart of summer fading as the world around her grew dim. She had done it. She had saved the world. As her eyes closed for the final time, she smiled. Spring had come at last.